Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Je donne à présent la parole à Monsieur Filippo Grandi.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you and greetings all from Geneva. Mr. Chairman, 1% of humanity lives now in forced exile. In the last 10 years, the number of people forcibly displaced has doubled to almost 80 million people now. We have reported, as many of you will know, we have reported this morning in our yearly document called Global Trends on Forced Displacement. It was issued this morning in Geneva. So this opportunity to meet with you is extremely timely. And I want to thank France and all of you for inviting me. These global trends represent, in a way, if you wish, the human impact of a decade of crisis that you are very familiar with. Wars, violence in different forms, persecution and discrimination against people and groups, countries in which social breakdowns prevail. All of this, as you know very well, accelerated by poor governance, by the climate emergency, by prevailing inequality and exclusion. These trends somehow show how when leadership fails, when multilateralism, which you represent, doesn't live up to its promise, the consequences, the first consequences, are not felt in the global capital of our world. They're not felt in the homes of the powerful and of the rich. They are felt in the peripheries of nations, in the border communities, among the urban poor, in the lives of those that in fact have no power, and among them the refugees and the displaced, whose history too often is told only in numbers and statistics, who appear only in newspaper or our social media feed, who are often, unfortunately, simply pawns in political debate, or, frankly, Mr. Chairman, they are part of grotesque international squabbles on who can push them back and push them away harder and further. And now, for them, for this 80 million people, 79.5 million people, COVID-19 also has an impact. And I will refer to this in the course of my presentation. Let me say now at the outset that COVID-19 for refugees, for displaced people, but often for host communities as well, has exposed further their vulnerabilities. It has weakened even more their ability to cope with difficult situations. And unfortunately, frequently, it has stripped away the residual hope they have of a better future. But these figures that I have mentioned, and this one figure, and the COVID impact in general, are worrying also in other ways. They're symptoms of grave threats that are taking shape, because if the consequences of crisis that impact the most marginal are neglected, they will come back and affect us all, as COVID has demonstrated. We in UNHCR, we in the UN and humanitarian community will continue to do our part. And let me say that the work that we have done with all of you and other member states to establish a global compact on refugees last year, to organize a global refugee forum. This work has been invaluable, especially now it's visible in a time of crisis, but we continue to need your leadership and your concerted action. I will bring to your attention, I could bring to your attention many things, but I will bring you 3 areas of concern with a few concrete examples. First of all, this concern, the numbers of people displaced that we announced this morning, referring to 2019, has been rising now since 2012. 2011 was the last year in which this figure went down. Since then, it has risen year after year. How to stop that? Then this is the biggest and most difficult question. With COVID now, with the pandemic becoming even more a risk multiplier, interacting with the drivers of existing crises. Take, for example, the region that perhaps worries me most at the present time, the region of Sahel in West Africa. And we have, you have among yourselves, of course, Niger as a member state, a country that is very impacted by this crisis. This region is one of the leading regions in driving the displacement figures upwards, at least for the past couple of years. And it is, as you all know, it's the theater of one of the most complex regional crises. The features of this crisis are worsening. I met many of you back in February, my last visit to New York, when I was actually coming back from a tour of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mauritania. These indicators are worsening. The impact of climate change has been very devastating in the region. And you have heard from my colleague David Beasley from the World Food Programme how food insecurity is growing and affecting more than 5 million people in the sub-region now. More than 3,600 schools have been either destroyed or closed down because of violence, and now COVID has basically put on lockdown the entire education system. All of this, I don't need to tell you, becomes fertile ground for forced recruitment by armed groups of young people. But also in the region, livelihoods are being decimated progressively. Social cohesion between groups, as the president of Burkina Faso told me several times, is impacted even where it existed and was relatively strong. The authority of states is progressively weakened, and trust in that authority on the part of the population is eroded. On the one hand, as armed groups spread false information and substitute themselves to the state as service providers. On the other, because these same groups attack civilians mercilessly, including in refugee camps. And these attacks and this situation often is responded to by security reactions that also impact civilians, including through extrajudicial killings. All of this has become a very, very dangerous spiral. You yourself, the Security Council, visited the region in March last year. Since then, just to give you one indicator from our perspective, the figure of internally displaced people in Burkina Faso has grown 8 times. There's almost 1 million of them as we speak now, and Niger and Mali are also very badly affected. The humanitarian organizations are trying to play their part to support states. We have a very valuable dialogue with development actors, international financial institutions, and bilateral development agencies of some of your countries as well, and very concrete interventions. Very recently, a very interesting project started by the African Development Bank to help respond to COVID amidst displaced population. But frankly, we need a much more strategic application of development aid that tackles truly the root causes besides security, and that takes into account the growing displacement element of the crisis. The security responses, which have been in focus, which have been also at the center of your own discussions, must also protect civilians and must also allow for humanitarian access. There needs to be a more tailored, concerted effort to help states build or rebuild social cohesion between different groups. In other words, I always say that the Sahel is the land of strategies. The problem is not lack of strategies. The problem is too many strategies with too little coordination between security, humanitarian, development, and human rights aspects. So mine is a very strong call to action in this respect. Otherwise, I'm worried that the crisis may spill over to neighboring areas. And we, dealing with people on the move, observe this firsthand. We are worried about a spillover into coastal states of West Africa south of the Sahel. We're very worried about the proximity to the Sahel of the Lake Chad basin, where the crisis, fueled by Boko Haram action, has worsened in recent days. We have seen attacks in Nigeria as well, and we're worried also, of course, about the proximity in the north of the Libyan conflict. And we have to also add that the coronavirus pandemic is impacting as well the dynamic of population flows in the region. We have seen a reduction of those flows in the initial phase of the pandemic, but this is growing again between countries in the region and also towards the global north. And have no illusion, borders may be more tightly closed now because of the responses to coronavirus, but this will not stop people from moving. Smugglers are very shrewd and will adapt to the circumstances and create new offer. The only difference will be that for people embarking on those journeys, the situation, the travel will be even more dangerous. And by the way, Libya continues to be the theater of complex and mixed flows, impacted also by the conflict in Libya. Of course, you are all familiar with the military developments of the last 2-3 weeks in the country. This, by the way, has caused additional internal displacement in Libya. Whether the new balance of power between the different parties will be more conducive to stability remains to be seen. I hope so. What I know is that we must continue to focus also on the situation of Libyan civilians and of refugees and migrants. The detention has decreased, at least in the detention centers where we have access. We estimate that the migrants and refugees detained went from 5,000 to about 1,500, but for all of them, even those that we managed to extract, life continues to remain very risky, made worse by the constraints imposed by the pandemic. And departures by sea towards Europe, which had decreased, are picking up again, unfortunately, in the last few weeks. So, I can only repeat the appeals made before to you. Capitalize on the Berlin peace process. Aim for at least a permanent ceasefire, if not for peace. And meanwhile, let's redouble effort to prevent any retaliation and collective punishment against civilians, which is very dangerous. And let's continue to try and create space to mitigate abuses on refugees and migrants, arbitrary detention, and, very important, impunity of smugglers and traffickers of human beings. My second point is about protection. I think a few days ago, my colleague and friend Peter Maurer, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, spoke to you about how COVID was also a protection crisis, and I couldn't agree more with him. First of all, of course, COVID has stopped many things that we're doing, but it doesn't seem to have stopped war. Despite the call of the Secretary General for a call for a global ceasefire, conflicts have continued to grow. Of the figure that I shared with you, 79.5 million people forcibly displaced, 46 million are actually internally displaced. They're refugees in their own countries. Since the pandemic has started, we have seen, just to give you an example, because internal displacement is a symptom of conflict, since the pandemic had started, since that call for global ceasefire, there's been new internal displacement in 19 countries. In the last 2 months, we have seen a growth of 700,000 internally displaced people globally. I won't mention all the crises, just remember Yemen, of course, that you frequently debate, but also new and growing crises, like in the north of Mozambique. And they come with the usual features: great deal of insecurity, attacks on aid workers, restrictions of movement, and on the side of the internally displaced people, a much narrower access to protection and aid and support. Meanwhile, of course, refugee flows also continue in a context where access to asylum is becoming more difficult. At the moment, 75% of all states in the world have either fully or partially closed borders. And I want to thank those of you and other states that have continued, in spite of this, to admit asylum seekers and refugees. Niger, for example, to mention it again, which kept the doors open for people fleeing northwest Syria, and many other states that have maintained practical arrangements like quarantine, screening, documentation for people seeking to cross borders during the pandemic. But remember, in almost 2/3 of the cases of states, there have been no exception to the restriction, even to asylum seekers. I would like to recall another important statistic in this respect, that in spite of all the political rhetoric, 85% of the refugees continue to be in developing countries, in poor countries or middle-income countries. 73% of the refugees that we have counted have taken refuge not far away, but in a country next to their country. But we must remember that in spite of this imbalance, international protection is a global responsibility, is based on a fundamental responsibility sharing principle. And the negative trends that we observe in terms of refugee protection in Europe, in North America, in the Asia and Pacific region are placing the right to asylum, already threatened now or additionally threatened by the pandemic, in further jeopardy. Meanwhile, in the very large host countries in Africa, in Asia, Middle East, Latin America, pressures are mounting. And, if you analyze the responses to the coronavirus pandemic in respect of the refugee movements, this is very interesting. What we did at the very beginning of the pandemic, we appealed to states to include refugees in their responses. In the health sector, this was done by most states. I think everybody understood that it was important to include them, because if you exclude anybody, the risk spreads to the entire population. And many refugees contributed themselves to this response, including in Europe and in North America. It is much more difficult in my analysis to to realize that inclusion in the social and economic response that states are now putting in place to offset the economic impact, the social and economic impact of COVID. This is much more difficult economically, and it is much more difficult politically as well. Although, of course, refugees, displaced people, are among those most impacted by COVID from this perspective, as they depend largely on informal economies that are gravely limited by lockdowns. And in some countries, this situation is further exacerbated by growth of stigmatization, scapegoating, even xenophobia in respect of refugees and even vulnerable migrants. Take the Venezuela situation, for example, one of the most dramatic of the last few years. More than 5 million people have left the country. 4.5 million of these people have moved to the region, to 17 states in Latin America. 80% of these 4.5 million depend on the informal economy. And since the lockdowns in these countries are entering a spiral of debt, of destitution, often of evictions. Tens of thousands are actually, out of lack of stability, lack of means of livelihoods, are opting to return to Venezuela in a very complicated situation from the health point of view as well. This is why I want to appeal for redoubled efforts to support countries hosting Venezuelans. A few days ago, the EU and Spain chaired a pledging conference, which was quite successful. It is important that those pledges are now realized. Humanitarian assistance is key, by the way, also for those that opt to return to Venezuela, especially those in particular. It is very important also that the international financial institution and the development partners play their role in support of the hosting countries, hoping, of course, for a peaceful solution, a peaceful political solution of the Venezuela crisis that will allow this tension to abate. I would like also to refer to Syria, a situation which you're very, very familiar with. We have entered already during the pandemic, the 10th year of this crisis in a country devastated by war. A war, however, whose geography and dynamics have considerably evolved. Armed conflict inside Syria has largely abated, although it is still present in a few locations, and very acutely, in particular, in the northwest, in Idlib, as you know. At the beginning of the year, there were 1 million people, 1 million civilians displaced in that area. 25%, thanks also to the lasting ceasefire, have been able to return home. So the figure is still very big, but it has decreased. And I would really like to make a first appeal to you to use all the influence that you can muster to maintain the ceasefire and, of course, to continue to work towards a peaceful resolution of that crisis. But we tend to always look at Syria through the prism of these acute aspects of the crisis. It is important to look at it more broadly, also from the perspective of the Syrians themselves, including 5.5 million refugees still living in the neighboring countries. What does their future look like? And I'm afraid that if you look at through their prism, through their angle, it looks really like a very crippling legacy of prolonged crisis, which is evident if you visit Syria, exacerbated by a very dire economic situation, now made worse by the consequences of the pandemic and lockdowns, and by the widespread destructions. Most refugees in the region continue to tell us that they want to return home. They also, of course, continue to speak about their concerns, which prevent some from making that decision: security, rights, access to education and work. So it is very important that, and we will continue to work with the government on Syria on concrete measures to remove those obstacles and gain the confidence of people to return. But I want to be quite frank with you. The quest for solutions, in particular return, for those that are most impacted, refugees, displaced people, continues to be difficult because political tensions in the region, international political tensions, which you are very familiar with, are very high. So my strongest appeal here today is, in fact, please depoliticize humanitarian issues, including issues related to refugees and to their return when it is possible. We really need you, the Security Council, to work on an international posture that allows, finally, solutions to this conflict to emerge, that creates space for communities to actually recover, something that frequently we tend to forget. In the meantime, I'm also worried about the situation in the broader region. We have around Syria a number of countries that have been very generous in hosting millions of refugees and still host millions of refugees. They have helped save millions of lives. They have saved an entire generation of Syrian children. But now there is a deep economic downturn, caused by the lockdowns and by COVID that risks creating poverty that will wipe out the gains that we have achieved in the last few years. In Lebanon, 70% of refugee households have lost access to livelihoods. Nobody is working there because of the nature of work that they were employed in. And this is adding itself, of course, to the general fragility of the country, which you are familiar with. And the situation is difficult also in Jordan and in Turkey. In a few days, the Brussels IV conference, aid conference, chaired by the EU and the UN, will take place. It is an important opportunity to ensure that the progress that we have made pending solutions is not reserved, to step up the support to host countries, which need at this particular juncture a very strong signal from the international community. And we need to also continue to support the return, the right of return of the people who wish to go back to their country, but ensure that these returns are not driven by despair or lack of choices like for the Venezuelans, but are done as a deliberate and informed and sustainable choice. My last point that I want to mention is the need, which is a consequence of the other two, not to give up on solutions. 2/3 of the people that I have mentioned, or rather 2/3 of the refugees, people crossing borders, about 26 million of that figure, come from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. So if we could make progress on solution in just one of these 5 countries, this would transform automatically the lives of millions of people. Take Sudan and South Sudan, 2 overlapping and intersecting situations for decades. Between the 2 of them, these countries account for 10% of the world's refugees and displaced people. But we do have some opportunities there. It's encouraging that the Darfur peace discussions continue, for example, and that there are, although back and forth, and you know that very well, there is some progress in the South Sudan peace process, including yesterday the announcements that we observed. But both processes are very fragile and need support. And may I say that they may need bold support. For example, in how the international community will help Sudan in its road to recovery. Because drawbacks are very possible, and the pandemic, like everywhere else, is complicating the challenges. My last trip before lockdowns was to Khartoum, my last visit in March. I was impressed by how the government was striving to overcome the very damaging legacy that it had inherited. And in spite of the very difficult economic and other challenges present in the country, I was struck by the commitment to important discussions that we are having on, and in the humanitarian domain, this is about food security, for example, solving the displacement, internal and external displacement, areas in which UNHCR is very much involved, and the UN is actually investing resources in that. It's very vital that those investments continue. It's very vital that we continue to involve also the African Union and IGAD in the quest of solutions of displacement in the 2 countries, and that we sustain momentum even if the foreseeable future is likely to present some very tough moments. And a last practical or operational situation I want to mention in respect of solution, it may seem counterintuitive, but it is not, is Myanmar. You know very well, we've discussed it many times. I've come many times before you to discuss this matter. There's still almost 1 million Rohingya in Bangladesh, and here I want to commend Bangladesh also for having led a very significant response to the pandemic. This has, we have managed so far to limit the pandemic in one of the most overcrowded and under-resourced places in the world, and this was really thanks to Bangladesh leadership, but this will continue to need support. What worries me is that among the refugees there is a growing sense that solutions are not coming. that solutions, especially in terms of return to Myanmar, continue to be elusive. And this despair, we see it. We are multiplying our mental health programs because people are really very desperate. And we see this also translated in increasing departures on boats towards Southeast Asia. And this is extremely dangerous for people, and it's a very complicated issue to deal with at the regional level, although we're working with states to do that. But my point here is that we need to maintain focus on solutions. The big issues remain. We should have no illusions. Statelessness, access to right by the Rohingya community in Myanmar, and now this complicated by the growing conflict caused by the Arakan army. But I think, and I've said it many times also to you, we need to continue to work on concrete steps. We've made some very concrete proposals to the government of Myanmar to move things forward. We have proposed to intensify contacts between the Myanmar authorities and the refugee communities. We have proposed to link the small development projects that the UN is running in Rakhine State with growing space now with refugee community to be more strategic and to create more options for solutions. We have really encouraged the Myanmar government to make progress on areas that are very important for refugees: freedom of movement, citizenship, at least a gradual process, solution for internally displaced people. So my message here to you is we're grateful for your focus. Please continue to be focused on these issues, and please help us make progress on these steps. They may seem small steps, but it is only through small steps that we will arrive, that we will move positively to a solution. This is what refugees themselves are telling us. And I think it is very important, even in Myanmar, where contrary to Sudan and South Sudan, the signals are less evident, not to give up, not to give in to a narrative of impossibility. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, with just a few reflections. Still about this big rising displacement trends that I have mentioned at the beginning. They reflect, really, I'm sad to say, divisions that are far beyond the theater of the armed conflicts that cause this displacement today in our field operation. We see the international rivalries. We see, apologies if I sound very direct here, we see the consequences of so much hypocrisy and indifference, which plays out, unfortunately, tragically, in the lives of those that are uprooted and traumatized. Please echo, give follow-up to the ceasefire call of the Secretary General. Use your leadership and influence, the tools and resources that you have at your disposal to seek out and to expand space for solutions. You know, Mr. Chairman, we, the humanitarians, we follow very anxiously and very closely your debates. We worry about your divisions. By the way, we are not naive. By long experience, we understand very well the complexity of international politics. But we expect from you, the world expects from you, unity, at least where humanity is most wounded and trampled. We expect from you, the world expects from you, decisive, clear, and unanimous messages to end conflicts and pursue avenues for peace. Resolving forced displacement is not just a moral or humanitarian imperative. It concerns areas that are at the heart of the Security Council's mandate, areas that are your mandate, areas that are critical for regional and international stability, for the stability of the international economy, areas that are crucial to achieve justice in a world that yearns for reconciliation, to ensure that no one truly is left behind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.